So Alana and I are going to be talking about public defenders today. So in the status quo, if you get brought to case, if you get brought to trial for having committed a felony or criminal charge or something like that, in most cases you have the option to hire a private defender. You can go to like a law firm and be like, hey, I want you guys to be my private defender. I'll pay you X amount of money. So we're going to propose that we get rid of that. We force everyone to use public defenders. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about how this is going to make the entire system more fair, and we're going to have more fair trials as a result. The first thing I know is that in the status quo, there's a huge imbalance between the amount of time that that the DA can spend on a case versus the amount of time that a private attorney can spend on a case. So, like, the district attorney has an obligation to try as many cases as can be feasibly brought to trial as they can. A private attorney, on the other hand, can refuse to take cases that he or she doesn't think is worth their time or doesn't think are winnable. So what happens here is that you have selectivity going on one side that you can't afford on the other side. So a private attorney can spend 30 hours on a case, whereas the DA may only have 3 hours to spend on a case. We think that's incredibly unfair because it creates an undue pressure on the justice system that's already overburdened, and it also gives people who can afford it an unfair advantage. We think that you can prosecute more cases in a system where you force everyone to use public defenders because you have less of an arms race of time on either side, right? The DA doesn't feel the pressure to invest a huge amount of time on one case, whereas they know the private attorney is doing the same thing.
Okay, so I want to say that Denise's first point about the idea that people have an unfair advantage is not necessarily something that we're altogether unfamiliar with in the status quo. So for example, when it comes to speech rights, we allow people who have the ability to purchase TV time, to purchase the ability to get their voice out more than other people. We allow this because we think that it's such an important right. And this is especially true when you're considering the idea that someone could be going to jail, that ultimately every kind of integrity, that you're losing your property, you're losing time, you're potentially losing life in a criminal trial. I think it's really important that you have the ability to access the best possible attorney you can. I also think that we don't get any of the benefits that Denise says on her side of the house. I think that the difference in time becomes an issue when you actually have more people who are more public defenders who are forced to actually serve all of the cases, to serve rich people who could afford to hire other attorneys, when poor people who could never ever have afforded these attorneys cannot access these attorneys at all. Because there's so few of them. I think you get fewer lawyers in general, which is problematic, because I think you get a lot of people who enter the profession in order to go for a profit motive, but then end up becoming a public defender. So they have the incentive. Plus, you have people who do pro bono work. You have attorneys who are involved in the for-profit sector, who do a lot of good work helping defendants who don't have the ability to do so themselves. You lose all of those when you have no incentive, when there's no money.
So a couple of responses here. So Lana talks about how people can buy TV time and things like that. I don't know. I didn't really get a lot of that analysis, but the main response here is that people have the right to free speech, and we can't guarantee that everyone's going to get a 30-second commercial spot. That'd be ridiculous for the government to guarantee. We can guarantee that what's actually enshrined in the Constitution is that everyone has the right to a fair and expedient trial. At the point where you're not guaranteeing people the same access to the same types of legal resources, I think that there is a legitimate case to be made that people should have more fair access to fair trials. And I think that having public defenders actually will make trials more fair on the whole. I also think that forcing everyone to use public defenders is going to improve the use of prosecutorial discretion in the status quo. So right now, as I talked about earlier, the judicial system is overburdened. Prosecutors have to choose and pick between the different types of cases. They tend to pick the ones that they have the obligation to pick the ones that they think there's a case to be made. But in the status quo, because they're so overburdened, that not only have to take that into account, they also have to make decisions based on how much time they have to research certain cases. I think in a world where you have less of an arms race, the prosecutors feel less burdened to spend 30, 40 hours on one case and can distribute their time in a more equitable way and bring more cases to trial, or to settle more. I think this will actually incentivize more settlements, which I think is fine. I think it's better if we settle more cases outside of the trial so we can reserve those resources for the cases that really, really do need jury trials or judge trials. But I think that allowing prosecutors to make good calls is good.
Okay, so I think the problem with Denise's arguments in that last speech that she gave is that she really doesn't solve any of the problems with access. So, for one thing, you still have the idea that even though you have a lawyer who doesn't necessarily have the same resources as when in the public sector as the private sector, an individual who would have hired an attorney otherwise with their money still has more resources to make their case winnable. They can hire consultants. They can do the research. They have people on their side. They have influence. They have the power to be able to make their case winnable. So you don't solve any of the problems regarding access to actual case, and you're still going to get people picking the cases with the most high profile, the most essentially kind of profitable clients, because they have the ability to say, hey, we can take some of the burden off you. There's still less incentive to serve the people who have it least. And you get all of the problems that I mentioned before, where you actually get fewer attorneys entering the system. You get fewer attorneys who are really qualified, actually doing pro bono work and helping people who don't have the ability to do this. You don't solve this. You don't solve any of the issues of the arms race, because you still have a difference in equity and access. And I think it really is important to emphasize the first point that I brought up that Denise didn't seem to quite understand, in fact, and clarify, is just the idea that we generally, when something is a very important right, such as the right to an attorney, we allow people to try to access that right to the absolute best of their ability. So if Denise wants to solve the current problems in the status quo, I think that we do that by creating a better public system. We don't do that by saying there should be no private system, there should be no incentive to compete, no incentive to work, because